and was just getting a feel of people, actually. Anyway, I went for my second interview with Lydia James, who was the wife of Martin James, and said there was this possibility that he might be going, and they were terribly shocked, and what were they going to do if he was going to be a Kleinian and I was going, and there were phone calls to Miss Freud in Walberswick, and eventually they came back and said, well, they'd take me yet, as long as I mean, it was all crazy, they were all a bit crazy, really, as long as I would agree that if there were problems, I'd give up the training and not the marriage. And actually, I knew. You know, how do you know what you're going to do or feel or be? So it was a very uncomfortable.
You were married.
We were married. So we married. We were very respectable.
Very respectable.
Yeah. We married as soon as I got my degree and came as a married couple. Yeah.
So that put you off?
Well, that really discomforted me a lot, actually. Not that I wasn't prepared to give up the training, but I just felt somehow not thought about. And anyway, at this point, somebody, I don't even remember, suggested I go and talk to Mrs. Beck, who was then the head of the child psychotherapy training at the Tavistock. And she really grilled me, and she took me on seriously. I mean, she really went into where was I coming from and who was I. And actually, I did feel a very great relief. And there wasn't going to be a course for 2 years, but she sent me off to go and get some experience, and they would take me in 2 years. So out of such things, somehow that was where I landed.
I mean, I don't know how the time is and so on, but whether we should get on more to the society, would you? I mean, because I was also interested in your experience of London and the racism and anti-Semitism that you came across here.
You about.
Yes, I mean, it just seemed, having come from South Africa and you come to London, and it's even in a sense more shocking and more striking.
Yeah, it was very difficult, 1955, coming from South Africa, where we'd been very protected, really. You lived in a small community, and if you needed anything, there was somebody whose father owned a block of flats, or you could find your way, or somebody who knew where there was a job. And here we were. And I came very dark, as I am now, a lot of sun, and really from whites, my white South African background, to find I would phone for flats, and they'd say, yes, it's available, and I'd arrive and they'd take one look at me and it's gone. And I really and I thought, I know what you're thinking. You think I'm black. Actually, I'm not, but I'm not going to say that. And and it was actually very painful when you feel already displaced and not belonging and so. And then one where we finally got a flat. Abe was blonde, so if I went with him, it was actually a bit easier. But then we got one, and as the elderly couple, are talking about, yes, you can have the flat, one says to the other, but what about these other people we'd already promised the flat to? Oh, we just tell them we didn't like their damn Jew references. At which point we stood up and said, that's too bad, we're Jewish too. And they said, oh, we hadn't bargained for that. So it was, I'd never come up against anti-Semitism. I mean, it must have existed, and it was, of course it existed. The Afrikaners were a fifth column during the war in South Africa. But I'd never personally come up against it. So it was all pretty shocking stuff, actually. And painful. I mean...
No, it sounds as though prepared you for what you were in for at the British Society to some extent. And the spitting distance and so on.
Becoming...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, so then I was at the Tavistock. Finally, I taught for a year. It turned out that there was another course in a year. I didn't have to wait the 2 years. Started at the Tavistock, and that was a great feeling of finding a home, actually. Yeah. It was a very, for me anyway, a lovely place. Very small, friendly, warm, very welcoming. And people actually invited you home and stuff, which hadn't happened either in Abe's mental hospital world or where he was working, or my nursery school world where I was working. Suddenly there were people one could really make friends with, and that felt a great relief. But there were a lot of tensions. If we're thinking about the British Society, yeah, I mean, you know, we were within spitting distance of the Anna Freud clinic, and I think we didn't think they were fit to be spat upon. I mean, they didn't exist, you know. I mean, the contempt was huge, really, and the distance, the feeling we had nothing to do with each other. And then also there were the tensions within the clinic, which were painful, actually, between Mrs. Beck, who was an extraordinary, wonderful teacher, and I really owe her a lot. She was remarkable in her capacity to think into the mind of a baby or of a small child, but also a very difficult woman, and absolutely at loggerheads with Bowlby, and who was the head of the department. So there she was running this course within his department, and really terrible, and she was hugely contemptuous of him, actually. And he stood it in a stoical British stiff upper lip way for a long time, and eventually sacked her.
Yes.
And, you know, we felt outraged. I mean, we were all... but also, you know, looking back on it, could understand. And such a shame, because they're real issues. He was very much on the importance of the impact of experience on children. And this was just the time of the filming of A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital, and hugely important things that he was drawing attention to. But he was Scotomizing the internal world, or the fantasies of the child, or what the child's anger might contribute to the situation, and so on. Bick absolutely focused on the internal world of the child, and not wanting to know about the effect of the environment. You know, so you got the real...
Including the effect of the mother, you said.
To some extent. I mean, we were pushed into... You observed the baby, almost as though... And you could see, I mean, looking back on it, of course, it's so much easier to observe the mother than to observe the baby. So, in a way, I can see what she was trying to do, but it wasn't you observe what goes on between the mother and the baby. It was the baby, and terrific stress in those days on what was coming from the baby, really. Which was very interesting and illuminating.
Yes. But a bit one-sided.
But a bit really left out that kind of dimension.
I mean, I wonder, just to jump a bit, whether you think that issue, there was Marx and Freud when you were at university, and there's this Bowlby and Bick at the Tavistock, and I wonder if you feel that you've sort of, to some extent, I mean, I suppose the Kleinian group as a whole has shifted from those early days, but you too would say, I mean, you'd say that you pay attention to the history, to the global picture of the patient, to the world in which the patient lives, the mother and father.
Yeah. I think some more than others pay attention to that.
But I think you more than some.
But I think I do, actually. Yeah, I think subsequently having a child somehow made it absolutely clear to me you couldn't just think about what the child was putting into the... Absolutely clear what you were contributing for better and for worse.
Quite. I mean, and you as the analyst, of course.
And then it comes to you as the analyst too. So I think, I think probably I've spent my life trying to bring these things together in some way, and I don't think any of us ever get it quite right.
No.
But it remains a question. I mean, even, when you get old, you think about what you've done with your life, and I sometimes think, well, would it have been more usefully spent doing something out there? I don't know.
I mean, can I jump again to another... I was thinking about it, in a way Audrey touched on it, about how we restrict ourselves properly as analysts in certain ways. And I was just thinking about public roles. And I was thinking about Hannah Siegel, for example, and Psychoanalysts Against Nuclear War, which she did with Mo Laufer in particular, didn't they, at the start? But I wondered about whether you would have liked to do, and whether you, well, it's a different question, I suppose, whether as a psychoanalyst, how much you think one can do of that kind of thing, whether you would have liked to do more, whether, because I know you're interested in politics and the social world, and whether you would... Whether
I think the society should be doing more.
Both the society and you, or the individual.
I do think whether I should be, that undoubtedly, whether one might have... as a citizen, not just as a citizen, one has a social responsibility, and I do think, and maybe when I retire, I will find some other avenue. I don't know about the society, and I don't know about analysts and what we can... interestingly, of course, analysts were invited in the earlier days, before my time, I think, to contribute to debates, even parliamentary debates on issues about people, and we're now totally Scotomized, and also have perhaps withdrawn too, and whether we should have allowed a voice, but we're not always very wise about events either, and they are so complex that I don't know that, we can't just transpose what happens in the individual from what happens in a world that now seems too difficult for any of us to take in, actually.
I suppose this sort of little diversion we've gone on started with Bowlby and Bick, and the sort of striking contrast there was there, and I know which side you were on at the time, and which, but that was... Who else did you come across at that time? Well, you went into analysis, of course.
So I had to wait a long time to get an analyst. All the others had been placed, and I was the one who... probably because I was the youngest. Anyway, I didn't, and eventually Mrs. Bick came with the news, found an analyst for you. Who was it? The super Kleinian. Hans Thorner. The dread of dreads. So it was a terrible dilemma. Would I go and see him or wouldn't I? Anyway, I plucked up my courage and went to see him and confronted him with the story. I didn't know whether I could come to him. Anyway, he took it very seriously and so on. And at the end, actually had a little laugh and said he couldn't think what it meant to be a super Kleinian. Anyway, we spent the next 10 years finding out. But I think in the first instance, the Kleinians who talked so much about sadism were really sadists. And if you were a super Kleinian, you were a super, I think somewhere that was what was in my head. He was the most terrifying of all these witch analysts, that I landed with.
But you say it wasn't your experience.
No, he was very human, actually. He took a lot from me, I have to say. He was made to feel not a super Kleinian, but perhaps the worst of the Kleinians, or an unwanted Kleinian, as you might imagine, that somebody who came from my background might make their analyst feel. So he put up with a lot, and I mean, he had an extraordinarily human quality, actually, and, you know.
You said to me something about breaches in his technique that you got crossed with, as if he wasn't super enough.
In some way, yeah, my complaint about him was that he wasn't Kleinian enough, and I think I still hold that criticism with more, I hope, humanity now than then. But there were times when he really lost it, not in a bad way. In a way, I was thinking today of a for example. I mean, I went through terrible times. When I was 26, my son was born, and when I was 20, something like that, 1960, yes, 26, and the year later my husband died. So it was a kind of shocking event, actually, beyond, I don't want to talk too much about it because I'm still affected by it. Anyway, he was fantastically kind, caring, but also got involved as though he had to be my father, and a misguided father at that. So I had, it so happens, already applied. I'd by now qualified at the TABI, knew I wanted to go on in analysis, knew I wanted to go on with analysis, and I had applied to the Institute and was due for my interviews when Abe took ill. Anyway, and went through with the interviews in a kind of terrible way. Anyway, but before, as Abe got ill, Hans decided that I needed to do the training, but he decided to do the training I needed to do medicine. At that, and it's interesting thinking back on it, how medical the training was at that time. I mean, I remember people like Alan Tyson doing medicine in order to get accepted to the Institute.
You know, I had an experience of that because, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Can I? I mean, that I was interested in analysis in the 60s, sort of 66 or 7, and I went to see someone in London, and I got the impression from him that I should train as a doctor before applying. You know, that's what he'd done. He'd done an arts degree and a literature, and I thought I couldn't quite swallow that idea, you know. Anyway, but it was interesting. I also had
yes, I mean, it was a kind of culture that assumed I wouldn't get accepted if I didn't do medicine, and of course I should go out and do. And he really pushed at this, and it was mad, actually. I mean, me, no interest in medicine anyway. 1-year-old child, you know, I'm going to go and do medicine for 6 years, so they'll accept me. But he really got a kind of bee in his bonnet, and in a paternal way. I mean, so it wasn't, and somehow looking back on it, I think what I always knew, he was kind of on my side. But there were moments when he lost his grip on being an analyst and suddenly became, you know, an autocratic German father. And he had that quality. I remember his children saying, who I got to know, the whole family eventually, saying at 10 o'clock, Hans used to say to his children and grandchildren, bedtime children.
However old they were.
This is his grown-up children who were parents of the children at bedtime. So he had that kind of old-fashioned. So, you know, I feel very warmly towards him, but I gave him a hard time for this kind of thing, and it also made me think a lot about technique. And I do feel very strongly about trying to hold on to one's technique, really. And I think where I come from more and more is how important it would be in such a situation to know about the child, the patient's need for a father at that moment, and one's own wish to father or mother the patient. And that's what's needed, and what a poor substitute analysis is. And to be able to accept that and talk about it and not have to either act it out, which I think he did, or behave as though that wasn't required, and analysis was somehow better than parenting.
Yes.
And I think it's bearing how little we can give. Yeah, but if we can bear that, we can give a lot, actually. And it doesn't help anybody to think we can actually replace the missing parent at whatever level that might be.
That seems a very important, sort of central view, doesn't it, about what psychoanalysts think?
I think so, and I feel, and maybe this is, I think, sometimes the split between the groups, actually, because I think if you were to parody it on both sides, at its worst, some of the independents, and I think they're not coherent groups, I think, but some, let's say, independents actually start acting out, having to mother or father or give the patient something else because analysis isn't adequate. And that at its worst, Kleinians can behave as though analysis is such a supremely ideal thing that it doesn't matter what's missing. Yeah, and I'm parodying both sides of this, but I think that's where the split goes. And somehow, if one can bring that together, and really hold on to the strength, the richness of analysis, and the terrible deprivation when people want something else that analysis can't provide. But in a way that one really takes that on, I think one's in a better place.
I think as you speak, that something comes through about your, but something quite passionate, but also aware of limitations and so on. And I think that the whole struggle of technique against emotional over-involvement, but emotional contact, is. I think that's something that comes through from you, that you do try to hold on to both, and with the restrictions, and
I think none of us get it right.
Well, no.
I think it is impossible to be this ideal balanced person.
Of course.
Yeah, and one's either too emotional or too cool, and one analyst or another, or oneself on one day or another, or with one patient or another. I think it's a constant struggle.
And there are going to be different styles as well. That would work pretty well. There are going to be a range of things according to one's personality and style, aren't there? That
the best you can do.
The best you can do.
Yeah.
As Beyond said, making the best of a bad job.
And it is always a bad job.
Yeah. One of your first supervisors, wasn't he? And at that early stage, not long after Ava died, and something coming from the patient, and you remarked on his kindness.
It wasn't my first supervisor, of course. By the time I did the training, I'd done the child training, which in those days was a real child analytic training. We all had to be in analysis with 5 times a week analysis with a training analyst, and our cases were all supervised by training analysts. So it was very different than child psychotherapy often. So I'd had a lot of good supervision, actually, with my first case with Isabel Menges, my second case with Mrs. Beck, my third case, which a whole long other story, Paula Hyman, and then Dagmar Hunter and Mattie Harris. So I'd had a lot of good supervision, but my first, and at that time at the TAVI, I think I'm right to say, there was an enormous emphasis on what were the fantasies of the child, actually, as though you were somebody outside this, looking at the material and constructing a picture of what was going on in the internal world of the child and what were the child's fantasies. But very much Paula Hyman's, was it 1956 famous countertransference paper, wasn't really part of the scene yet. Beyond stuff on containment wasn't part of the scene. So it was much more, we were looking at the children and what was going on in their minds. And whatever you felt, it was nothing to do with that. And then Rosenfeld was my first supervisor for my adult training. And he was a very sweet man. He's very much in mind, because there was a book launch last night of a book that John Stein has just edited on Rosenfeld's work, and so a lot of talk about Herbert Rosenfeld. And he was a sweet man, actually, also with an amazing clinical sense, but much more a feeling of the whole person, of the patient in a world that he occupied, but also suddenly of you. And the first experience of that was the very first week with my first adult patient. There was something in the material about what was going on at my weekend. And Herbert said to me very gently, you're going to need to take clearly the picture of the couple at the weekend. And there I was, not a couple. And Herbert terribly gently said, you know, you're going to need to take this up. In fact, I had taken it up, and it was perfectly he wasn't, the patient at that point wasn't doing it in a way that I could take it, that I couldn't deal with it. But it was the gentleness with which he dealt with this, that I knew, that he knew it was a difficult area for me. And it was the first time somebody actually touched on how you were affected in a direct way by the patient's material. And it was, so it was both the feeling of the patient as a whole person, but in some way also you as a whole person, not just an analyst, but also where you were. And that made a big impact, actually. And I got a lot from that. And I think it felt a great relief. In some way, meeting something that felt just all very interesting, because he wasn't really like that in his own life, I don't think so much. I don't think his own family would have seen him in that way. And yet, as an analyst, he was supremely that way, I think. Anyway, as a supervisor, let me say, which was how I knew him. So, and then my second supervisor was Bion, and so I have a very good pedigree, I have to say. I always remember Manny Curl, who was Eton, Oxford and Queen's Guard. Was his background. The one true Englishman in us, apart from you. But anyway, it was Bion, who was another kind of experience. But,
well, tell us about that.
Well, that was a much more unsettling experience. I mean, much less feeling looked after, much more thrown up against it, and much more your world turned upside down. Before I had supervision with him, I presented this other case that I had with Herbert in a clinical seminar. And when I'd finished presenting, the group was very silent. Now, I think I was very difficult for my group at the Institute, because and most of them had disappeared off the face of the earth. I don't think I did that to them. There were 17 of them, and I think the only one of us, you see, I'm saying them, which is a sign of how it was, actually. I didn't feel part of that group. The only one who's still in sight is Manny Lewis. And the rest, couple went to Canada, and I don't know what happened to them, but they're all... So anyway, I think I felt I'd made very good friends at the Tavistock, and at the Institute I felt very alienated from the group. I think partly I had much more training, analytic training, behind me than they had. And also I had experience of life which they hadn't had. Yes. So I felt, in any case, there was this terrible silence for a long time. And I said, maybe I haven't given you enough material. And beyond, I think that may be what you're meant to feel. And it went on being silent. Anyway, I was left with that, but it did make me think, actually, both what was the group doing, perhaps, to me, but also was there something coming from me, that this is my problem, or coming from the patient. I mean, it opened a lot of unsettling possibilities. And so his cryptic style, which also left you to have a very private experience, it was very interesting because it was very unintrusive. I mean, you weren't required to expose your experience to Beyond of this. You were invited to have a private experience of actually thinking about what might be going on with the group, with the patient, with you, that I got a lot from, actually. If that makes... anyway, that was before I started the supervision with him, but I think a lot of the supervision had that kind of very unsettling quality of something quite unexpected coming at you and left in the silent place. I don't mean that he was so silent, actually, he wasn't. No. But somewhere there was a silence. That
it's interesting what you say, because sometimes, occasionally, reading, for example, Beyond on groups, I had the feeling, how provocative was his silence, and his manner of giving interpretations and so on. But what you're saying is that it wasn't provocative, it was thought-provoking. And it was almost as if he could be in his space, and therefore it was all right for you to be in yours.
Space.
Would that be? Not that.
I think that was the best of him.
Yeah.
I think if you... and I think the best of him was pretty bloody marvellous, actually. Yes. I really do, and I got an enormous amount from it. I think the less good side of that was if you were in a play, if you were his patient maybe, or if you were in a place where this was too threatening for you, I think that would have been very difficult, actually. And I think he didn't always take enough, from stories I've heard, not from, it wasn't my experience, but stories I've heard, and from a bit my experience, because I had this supervision with him for a year, and then it ended, and I think, I can't remember quite how the time went, but anyway, he went, if this was when he went to America or not, but in any case, the next time I saw him, which wasn't so long after that, he didn't recognize me. So he didn't actually know who I was, and I thought that was a bit how it was, actually, that there was something coming probably from his history. Whoever's read The Long Weekend, it's a marvellous book, actually. I think in some way, for me, the best thing he's written. Anyway, you understand where he was coming from. But I